So I'm here to do my favorite thing, which is complain about Republicans. Now, I know some of you are Republicans and proud of it for whatever reason I can't fathom. But bear in mind, I know lots of really, really good people who are Republicans. I know lots of really good people who are Trump supporters. So it's not directed at you. My issue is with the Republican ruling class and the Republican media. So just for example, today, on the front page of the New York Post, which is part of the Republican media, like Fox News and these others, there's a picture of Biden standing in line with all the G7 heads of state. And he's right next to this very attractive Italian, I don't know what they're, president, prime minister. But they're all facing one way and Biden's facing another way. And then the picture shows her reaching up and touching him on the shoulder. And then the headline and the article say that here's why Biden is out there embarrassing America again. He's lost and wandering around. He doesn't know where he's supposed to be. And this prime minister of Italy had to turn him around so that he was facing the camera because they were all there to have their pictures taken. As if Biden is so feeble-minded that he doesn't realize that the picture-taking event is going in the direction opposite his back. The truth of the matter is, I saw the video, he was talking to some paratroopers who had dropped in on some ceremonial thing, and he was talking to these people while everybody else was getting ready for the picture. And when they were ready for the picture, the prime minister reached out, touched him on the shoulder, and he turned around and said, "Oh, okay, thanks," and stood there and had his picture taken with everybody else. That was it. And yet, here's the Washington Post, the New York Post, which to me is a perfect example of the Republican lie machine that is going on all the time and has been going on all the time since I was a little kid. I remember reading the Indianapolis Star when I was a little kid in Indianapolis, and it was just disgusting. They lied constantly, and they just do it. They just do it. I remember the Chicago Trib back when I was a kid was a horrible newspaper. Remember how they used to lie about Harry Truman all the time? Before your time, I'll warrant. Except those of you who were my roommates in law school. Hi, John. So, yeah, I think John's as old as I am. Maybe older. That's not possible. Anyway, so that's just an example. But here are my issues, and Trump and the Republicans just brought them. It just highlighted them for me. This last week. And that is, I have six issues with the Republican Party, and those are issues where you should all be on my side on these. The first is the national debt. The second one is taxes, which is relevant to the national debt. Okay. The third is the enforcement of federal laws through the antitrust laws and the regulatory agents. Then you've got, I don't remember what all the rest of them were, but the way they do politics. But abortion is another one, the environment is another one, and gun control. So those are the six. So first of all, anybody who doesn't realize we have a problem with our environment right now is just lying to themselves and/or, as the Republicans are doing, lying to the people, because they know that the issue with the environment is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causing a greenhouse effect, which is causing global warming to increase at a rapid rate. I'm in Florida sitting here waiting for this. It's going to be one of the worst hurricane seasons ever because the Atlantic Ocean near the Gulf Stream is hotter than it's been in a long time, maybe ever. And so we can expect hurricanes because of that. That's all global warming. And what side of the Republicans are on that? Drill, baby, drill, says Trump. So the environment is an issue. Gun control. Why in the world should people be running around carrying AR-15s? But that's not the point. The point is, in poll after poll after poll, one, people favor doing something about the environment. Two, people favor something about stopping the individuals getting hold of assault weapons and better background checks and all that sort of thing. People overwhelmingly favor those things, and yet the Republican Party on every one of those issues is on the side of the big business, of the special interests, particular special interests, guns and oil. And they're not on your side. But those are just two. The third one I said was the abortion issue. Now, that's not a big issue with me personally, but it certainly is an issue with millions of American people, and regardless of how you are personally affected by it, it's an issue where the public opinion is overwhelmingly against where the Republicans are on that issue as well. So that's three issues right there, where the Republican Party is out of step with most people, and it probably includes you, even if you're Republicans. Particularly abortion. I'm going to digress for just a second, but abortion was never a Democratic issue. And I remember when Ronald Reagan and Nelson Rockefeller each signed a constitutional amendment to the respective states, California and New York, both of which used to be Republican, signed on both those states the constitutional amendment to make Roe versus Wade incorporated into the constitutions of those two states, because Republicans overwhelmingly favored abortion rights because it was fundamental to their views as a party, which is basically government should stay out of everybody's business. Now, usually that means stay out of enforcing antitrust laws or stay out of regulating dangerous businesses, but it also logically extends to not having the government come in and tell you to make medical decisions for you. So that was a Republican issue until until Roe versus Wade, and then Nixon started his Southern strategy, and all the preachers looking for some issue suddenly made it a big Christian issue. It never was before. And all these Southern Christian leaders out there, Jerry Falwell et al., that suddenly became their issue of choice. And so because it was a big political issue, it became a wedge issue, that they used that to peel people, Southerners, away from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. Now what's happening, of course, is that's backfiring on the Republicans, and they're finding themselves losing on that issue in all kinds of red states, like Kentucky and Kansas. So, but it's just ironic that's an issue where the Republicans switched on that for, again, shallow, obvious political reasons, and now it's hurting them. So those are three right there. Then the other three I said were the national debt and taxes and enforcement of federal regulations. So let's take the federal regulations first. I'm an antitrust lawyer as well as a patent lawyer. I've actually won an antitrust case as well as patent cases in the United States Supreme Court. So I know a little something about these subjects. I've also written books on them. So I'm not just somebody who went to a cocktail party or read an article somewhere. I'm pretty much steeped in these subjects. And the history of the Republican Party has been ending with Teddy Roosevelt. Remember, who was the author of the Sherman Antitrust Act? It was General Sherman's baby brother, Senator Sherman from New York. I'm almost 80 years old. I was able to say that without even pausing. Don't ask me to do it again. Okay, General Sherman's baby brother, the senator from New York. Sherman Antitrust Act. In those days, the big fight between liberals and conservatives was within the Republican Party. And the Democrats were all in the South, and they were still simmering over slavery. Somebody we'll discuss later. But so the antitrust laws were that pitched Teddy Roosevelt against primarily Carnegie, not Dale Carnegie, Alexander Carnegie of the Carnegie Steel Company, Andrew Carnegie. So, but it was also Rockefeller, it was Frick, it was Mellon, it was the Commodore Vanderbilt. It was all of the big money, big industrialists who did not want the government interfering with what they were doing in any way, shape, or form. They didn't want child labor laws. They didn't want maximum hour laws. They didn't want minimum wage laws. They didn't want any kind of health and safety laws. They wanted to do what they wanted to do and make as much money as they could without the government interfering, and they particularly hated the antitrust laws. So Teddy Roosevelt, was that part of that liberal Republican group who was trying to enforce General Sherman's baby brother's Antitrust Act, and that's when he butted heads with all of those special interests. Then he unfortunately didn't run for re-election because he promised he wouldn't, and Taft took over, and Taft was the beginning of a long line of nice Republican whores as presidents. He just knuckled right under for big business, stopped enforcing the antitrust laws, and that was really the beginning of the end of the Republican Party's attempt to enforce the antitrust laws. So, Ronald Reagan basically shut the antitrust business down. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, most private antitrust cases, unlike the ones I tried, but most of them were piggybacks. Somebody would wait for the government to file an antitrust act, and then they would jump in to those cases and they assert the interests of all of their competitors as companies that had been injured by the antitrust violations of the companies that were brought into court by the federal government. Ronald Reagan shut that down. He didn't do anything about the antitrust laws till they got to the AT&T matter right at the end of his administration, and he did do a good job, depending on where you're coming from, on breaking that up that monopoly. But the general business of relatively small companies eating up smaller companies to become giant companies and shut down competition, that continued like crazy during the Reagan administration. So I had a Supreme Court case, I think I just mentioned, in an antitrust case, and I was up against the George Bush Jr.'s antitrust department, and it ended up being against his entire Attorney General and all of his staff, and they came in on the side, it was a private dispute, it had nothing to do with them, they came in on the side of the people that we were suing. We won, but the Supreme Court let them come into the case and even argue. So that antitrust thing is something most people don't know about. But trust me, it's not good for you if you're a Democrat or Republican, because competition is a good thing, not a bad thing. But Republicans have always sided with big business when it comes to the antitrust laws, and I know what I'm talking about. I'm asking you to take my word for it, because I've been doing this for over half a century. That does not seem possible. It isn't possible. I made that up. I've only been doing it for 2 years. So, the other thing, and this is the part that really bothers me most of all, is the debt and taxes. So, what do Republicans always do? First chance they get is they slash taxes for the people who don't need it. Big companies, the wealthiest people. Who did that? Well, let's see. Warren G. Harding did it. Calvin Coolidge did it. Herbert Hoover did it. And the result of that 10 years between 1920 and 1929, guess what happened? Yeah, you got it. We ended up with the Great Depression, and it was to a large extent because of those tax cuts. Then things got back into a balance, and taxes were raised under Eisenhower. Eisenhower was actually a much better president than we used to give him credit for. My parents didn't like the fact that compared to Roosevelt, who was active, and Truman was active, Eisenhower didn't do much except the federal highway system, but he did some other things too. He integrated the schools in Arkansas and Little Rock. He stood up to Israel when Israel and France and England tried to take over the Suez Canal. He did things, but most of the time he played golf, and he kind of was a neglect president. But status quo. Nothing really went really bad when he was president. But the next person who came along to just destroy the economy was Ronald Reagan. Now, I know Ronald Reagan is a saint, and the Democrats, just sit back and let everybody talk. Well, Ronald Reagan was wonderful. He was the Republicans never talk about what a great president Jack Kennedy was, or Franklin Roosevelt, or Harry Truman. But we're supposed to say, oh, what a great president Ronald Reagan was. Well, I give Ronald Reagan some credit. Charming guy. He was Irish, of course. And he had good values. But he was all in for the rich. First thing he did was slash taxes. Second thing he did was tell the banks to back off and basically give people whatever loans they wanted to do. And he's supposed to, we have a regulatory agency that's supposed to be regulating the banks and supervising them and making sure they don't make stupid things like, for example, lending money for somebody to build a ski resort on the side of the mountain that doesn't have snow. That happened under Reagan. So as a result of Reagan's refusal to actually get in there and enforce regulations and slash taxes, the national debt trebled under Reagan, and the banks collapsed. So we had to do so poor Bush comes along, Bush Sr., who was a good man, and he has to deal with this. So one of the things he did was raise some taxes, and the Republicans never forgave him for that. And then they did this whole massive thing where they were taking properties that had gone into foreclosure because the banks had made terrible loans because the federal government stopped supervising them, and we started these whole programs to bail them out. I knew lawyers who their whole entire career was based around enforcing those programs and helping people sell off this junk property. That was because of Ronald Reagan. Now, nobody talks about that today because our media doesn't scrutinize things the way I do, and the way you are now going to start to. So there's Reagan slashing taxes, not regulating businesses, and what happened as soon as he left office, the Bush administration takes over and ends up in a recession, and he's out. And so Bill Clinton came in, raised taxes, pulled us back from that recession, put an end to unemployment, and most of all, started increasing the amount of money that the federal government was keeping, including putting up a surplus where we were within $300 billion of paying off the national debt. And then he leaves office, and George Bush Jr., who I think is a fine person, he came in, and the first thing he did was get rid of all of the surplus, including giving a bunch of it to his brother, who was then governor of Florida, so he could give it to some fly-by-night businesses here. And there we go again. And then he slashes taxes, and there you go, right back to the trillions of dollars in debt. Then Barack Obama comes in, and he deals with that situation. What happens? Unemployment goes down from like the 12% or whatever the hell it was under Bush, maybe it wasn't quite that high, down to let's sell over 4%. Save the automobile industry, save the banking industry, both of which were on the skids because of the decisions made in the Bush administration's government. Remember, that's the government that I was up against in the Supreme Court because they tried to essentially gut the antitrust laws. I don't even know if Bush had any idea what these people were up to. But that's what happened. So that's Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Reagan, Bush, and then Barack Obama comes in. Again, he didn't raise any taxes, but he stopped the renewal of one of the Bush tax cuts that started bringing some revenue in, and the debt started going down, but we still didn't get a surplus, so we weren't reducing the deficit, but we were reducing the debt, and we could have gone further if we'd been able to reinstate some of the Clinton taxes. But instead of that, after Barack Obama, in comes, that's right, Donald T. First thing old Donald T. does is he slashes taxes. That takes trillions of dollars of revenue out of the federal government. He didn't cut spending, he just cut taxes. Which means that all of a sudden the national debt is in the trillions, and we'll never see the end of it now. We're never going to pay off this debt. It's impossible. Because of this mismanagement by constantly cutting taxes that benefited the wealthy. Now, I want to hear about, well, Kennedy raised taxes. You're talking to somebody who knows these things. I built a shopping center based to a large extent on the Kennedy tax cuts because it had special depreciations for particularly targeted investments, accelerated depreciation, investment tax credit, and I used those when I built the shopping center. And it helped me greatly. And Kennedy's targeted, and that's the key, targeted tax cuts resulted in a lot of industries coming back. The Republicans aren't doing targeted tax cuts; they're just doing across-the-board tax cuts. So they're not. You don't have to invest in anything to get the tax cut. All you have to do is file your tax return. It's done for you. That's wrong. It's run morally, but more significantly, that's why the national debt keeps exploding. And now what's he talking about doing on the campaign trail this week? He wants another tax cut. $1 trillion tax cut. Again. Now, people are complaining about inflation, but I don't think most people know what causes inflation, or even what it is. Inflation is a situation that exists when you have excessive demand, increasing demand, without corresponding increase in supply. Now, is that causing oil prices to go up, gas prices to go up? No, because that's not inflationary. You don't see people in long lines at the gas station like we did when Jimmy Carter was president. You see those long lines at the gas, you didn't see them once the Arab oil embargo stopped, and we started getting our money coming back in. Incidentally, we pump more oil now than we ever have. But we don't have a shortage of oil causing prices to go up. Prices are going up because people have more money to spend. People have more money to spend to a large extent because the government has been putting money into the economy. And when the government puts money into people's economy, they put it in people's hands, people have money to spend, and they spend it. They don't have to spend it, they spend it. There's no reason why every time there's a holiday, we have record numbers of cars going all over this country. Why don't they just stay home and save the gas if gas prices are so high? But that's just kind of a personal beef I have when I see people on TV, the gas stations complaining about how high how much high gas prices are, and then the interview continues. It turns out that they're traveling from Indianapolis to Salt Lake City to take the family out to look at the Great Salt Lake. Which, if you've ever had a chance to go visit this Great Salt Lake, don't do it. It smells awful. God, I almost choked to death out there. But that's a different story, and we're not here to complain about all the horrible experiences I've had, because if we did, I'd never get off the air. Which right now you're thinking, does he ever get off the air? Does this man ever stop talking? See, I just did. Yeah, not for long. Okay, so anyway, so to cut taxes again when we're in the middle of inflation is another inflation driver. In the meantime, we hear Trump and House members of the House and the Senate Armed Services Committee talking about we have to really get out there, and unlike Biden, we have to really beef up our Navy. Do you have any idea how much it's going to cost to beef up the Navy? Well, I'm trying to imagine it and I can't. Suffice to say, military spending is the most inflationary spending there is, because it's money that goes into the pockets of the people building the ships. And my dad was a head of contract law for a long time in the Air Force, so I know a little something about military contracts. In particular, I know about the waste. I know how mad my dad used to get about all that military waste. But it's inflationary by definition, because you're paying people to make products and there's nothing to be consumed in the process. So it's just increasing demand without increasing supply. It's not complicated. It's basic economics. So we're sitting there with the Republicans talking about cutting taxes again. In the meantime, massively increasing federal spending. What do you think that's going to do to inflation? So they constantly complain about Biden's inflation, and incidentally, inflation is amazingly coming under control now, because people finally realize they can't keep spending all the time just because they feel like it, or just because they have some money in their pockets. And I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it going to the store, to the grocery store, to restaurants, to the theater. People just aren't going out and spending money the way they used to be, and at some point in time, that could go into a recession and even a depression. So inflation is not really the problem to me right now. The problem we have to watch out for as a country is deflation, because deflation leads to depression. Inflation doesn't. Inflation sometimes leads to deflation, which is what we're looking at right now. But that's not Biden's fault. It's the fault of the national debt primarily, and the fault of the national debt is primarily the fault of these tax cuts, and now the Republicans want to cut taxes, massively increase military spending, and we're off again. So that's the debt, it's taxes, it's federal regulations, and then the social issues, the guns, the abortion, and I forget what the other thing was they said. Well, anyway, I told you already, go rewind and see it for yourself. Don't make me do all the work here. Anyway, there's the 6 issues, and those are the 6 issues that I have with the Republican Party. Not just now, you may have gathered, but historically. And I took you back to, basically Teddy Roosevelt. We could actually go back beyond that, and it's funny how time is. I used to think my great-grandfather, that's old great-grandfather, until I have good friends now who are great-grandparents, and I'm hanging out with their great-grandchildren. And I realize, great-grandparents not that old. Why do I talk about my great-grandparents? Because my great-grandfather, not my great-great-grand, just my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, so he was my great-grandfather. He was a finance chairman for President Benjamin Harrison. Now, if you don't know who President Benjamin Harrison is, I only have one thing to say to you. You have not lived in Indianapolis. So, even if you have lived in Indianapolis, you probably don't know who he was. But Benjamin Harrison was the president who ran against Grover Cleveland. He beat Grover Cleveland, and then Grover Cleveland came back and he beat Benjamin Harrison. It's the only time that's happened in history. Trump is trying to repeat that and become the Grover Cleveland to Biden's Benjamin Harrison. And Benjamin Harrison was an honored general. He came from a long family of heroes, including former President William Henry Harrison. But Benjamin Harrison was, that was, to most people, that was like, what? That was back in the 1800s. That was between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, between Lincoln and McKinley, if you pay any attention to history. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right, because you had Grover Cleveland, you had Benjamin Harrison, and you had Grover Cleveland again, and then you had McKinley, and then you had Teddy Roosevelt. So basically, we're talking 5 presidents away from the turn of the century, and that was my great grandfather's next door neighbor. So if you talk to me about Teddy Roosevelt or Calvin Coolidge or Harding or Herbert Hoover, those to me that was yesterday, right? that was when my parents were around. So time is funny, and the older you get, the more time shrinks for you, and you realize 100 years ago that was nothing. I'm almost 100 years old now. So I'm digressing, but that's what old people do. That's my right as an old person. I know my rights, officer. All right, and your right is to have me shut up and go away, so I'm going away for now, but I'll be back tomorrow.